My friends have made the American people think me a sort of Superman, able to cope successfully with the most difficult and complicated problems. They expect the impossible from me, and should there arise in the land conditions with which the political machinery is unable to cope, I will be the one to suffer.
Those are the words of Herbert Hoover, our 31st president, and the subject of this, the 31st episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the Dead Presidents Podcast. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
And we're here with the life of Herbert Hoover, our 31st chief executive. And rest assured, listeners, there will be no vacuum cleaner jokes here, because they suck.
Indeed.
We're going to get straight down to the brass tacks on Herbert Hoover. Herbert Clark Hoover, to be exact, who was born on August 10th, 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, a tiny Quaker farming community. His father, Jesse Hoover, was a blacksmith and a mechanic who achieved success selling new mechanized farm equipment. His mother, Huldah Minthorn Hoover, was born and raised in Canada and was a devout Quaker deeply involved in the community church. When Herbert was 2 years old, he contracted the croup, which is a respiratory infection, and it got so bad that he stopped breathing and turned blue, and the family thought he was dead, actually wrapping him in cloth and putting a dime on each eyelid before the doctor, his uncle, John Minthorn, arrived and was able to resuscitate him.
Wow. Life of Herbert Hoover was almost a very short one.
Indeed.
Well, he would continue to live, and when he got to be 6 years old, his father died of a sudden heart failure. And then when he was 9, his mother died of pneumonia and typhoid. Herbert Hoover, now an orphan. He and his older brother Theodore and his younger sister May were split up and taken in by different family members. Herbert spent a year with his uncle Allen Hoover before being sent to Oregon to live with his uncle, John Minthorn. Herbert disliked the farm chores he was assigned and resented his uncle as a strict disciplinarian, but when he got the opportunity to work for pay outside his uncle's farm, he worked long hours and saved his meager wages, harboring a dream of achieving independence.
There you have it. In terms of education, young Herbert attended a Quaker academy that his uncle helped run, but he would drop out when he was 13, when his uncle moved to Salem, the state capital, and he joined the Oregon Land Company. Herbert took a job as an office boy and immersed himself in the company's business, learning skills like accounting, typewriting, making blueprints for roads and properties, and coordinating company advertisements. One employee recalled, quote, "Herbert Hoover was the quietest, the most efficient, and the most industrious boy I ever knew in an office. He even wore quiet shoes, and you never knew he was around until you wanted something. And then he was right at your elbow. He knew everything about the office, and the rest of us never tried to keep track of things. It was easier and quicker just to ask Bert about it." Sounds like Herbert Hoover would have made a good assassin.
Well, he certainly made a great office boy, and that's just the beginning for him. He had done little reading outside of the Bible until his Sunday school teacher, Miss Gray, took an interest in him, encouraged him to go to the library, which he did, and he would develop a lifelong interest in literature. Miss Gray invited him to Sunday dinners at her home and lectured him on taking responsibility for his future. A friend recalled that Hoover, quote, worshipped Miss Gray and did anything she suggested. He took business classes at night school, and after running into a mining engineer who told him that the profession was in demand and lucrative, he decided to pursue an engineering career at a brand new tuition-free college that was opening in Palo Alto, California. Stanford University was desperate for students and accepted Hoover even though he failed the entrance exam twice. He enrolled in Stanford's inaugural class in 1891. He began to study mechanical engineering, but switched his focus to geology, earning mediocre grades and doing the minimum of work, but absorbing huge amounts of information by cramming just before exams.
That's just it. And he worked even harder outside of his classes, earning money to pay for his room and board by delivering newspapers and laundry. He also managed the college baseball team and football team. He organized a lecture and concert series and became the class treasurer. He was so serious about his duties that when ex-president Benjamin Harrison attended a Stanford baseball game, Hoover quietly confronted him and insisted that he pay for a ticket. He gained his most valuable education during 2 summers of his college career when he worked as an assistant for a renowned geologist, Waldemar Lindgren, with the U.S. Geological Survey. Hoover traveled to mines all over the western states and learned a great deal from Lindgren, who was impressed by Hoover's tireless work ethic and innate problem-solving abilities, saying, quote, "Never have I had a more satisfactory assistant." During Hoover's senior year at Stanford, he met Lou Henry, a freshman and the only female in the college's geology program, a banker's daughter, who was born in Iowa, just 70 miles from Hoover's own birthplace. Unlike Hoover himself, Lou was friendly, gracious, and outgoing, and he accompanied her to a party and spent a lot of time with her before his graduation in 1895 with a degree in geology.
Well, those two are going to keep in touch, but Hoover is going to embark on his career now. Unfortunately, he had expected to receive a job at the U.S. Geological Survey, but cutbacks resulting from the recession sparked by the Panic of 1893 prevented him from getting that job, so he headed to Northern California hoping to secure a managerial job in some mining operation, but he ended up taking the only mining job he could find as a low-paid manual laborer. He finally got his break when he met Louis Janin, a legendary mining engineer, and he impressed Janin with his knowledge of certain mines that had been surveyed by Lindgren that were the subject of a lawsuit in which Janin was an expert witness. In 1896, Janin hired Hoover as a mine scout, and Hoover traveled all over the Southwest evaluating potential mines and proving to be the most efficient mine surveyor Janin had ever met. His salary was raised to $2,000, almost double what he had expected to make with the U.S. Geological Survey, which now offered him a job that he turned down.
Indeed. In 1897, Janin recommended Hoover for a $5,000 per year job with the London-based firm of Buick Moring and Company, even though the company was seeking an experienced engineer of at least 35 years old, and Hoover was only 22. Hoover traveled east of the Mississippi for the first time in order to board a ship to London, where he met the firm's partners while posing as a 36-year-old. They were not fooled, but he got the job and boarded a ship headed for Australia via the Suez Canal. Arriving in Australia on the tail end of a speculative gold rush, he scouted for mining opportunities, often surveying several sites each day and traveling hundreds of miles away from civilization, sometimes aboard a camel, through hellish terrain in which the temperature did not get below 100 degrees, even at night. He persuaded Buick Moring to spend $500,000 on a new lease and put him in charge of operating the mine. It produced huge amounts of gold and became one of the most lucrative mines in Australia. Hoover ran his operations with ruthless efficiency, firing ineffective workers, shutting down unprofitable ventures, opposing minimum wage and workers' compensation proposals, and importing cheap Italian immigrant labor. Buick Moring eventually controlled 50% of Australian gold production, and Hoover's salary was increased to $10,000, and he was made a junior partner. However, he felt that he should have been named manager of the company's entire Australian operation, and an open feud developed between Hoover and the incumbent manager, with Hoover trying to organize his fellow engineers to oppose the manager, and the manager demanding that Hoover be fired for insubordination. Buick Moring diffused the situation by quote-unquote promoting Hoover to the job of pursuing mining opportunities in China.
Wow, young Hoover, quite the globetrotter.
Indeed.
And as we mentioned, he kept up a correspondence with Lou Henry, and the two of them may have had an informal understanding about their future together, but they had not actually seen each other in over 2 years when Hoover popped the question by way of a succinct telegraph. Quote, "Going to China via San Francisco, will you go with me?" She replied with an even more succinct answer, yes. Lou had graduated from Stanford with a degree in geology, but she was unable to find a job in the field due to sexist prejudice.
Yep.
Hoover returned to California in December 1898, and the couple was married on February 10th, 1899, and sailed for China the following day, stopping off in Hawaii for a brief honeymoon. Upon taking up residence in China, the Hoovers developed a deep interest in its history, culture, and language, with both working to learn the Mandarin language, though neither achieved fluency, and Lou progressed somewhat further than her husband. Hoover wrote, quote, "I like the place, the life, the people, the climate, the birds, the wondrous flowers, the grand sunrises, the novelty, the antiquity. In fact, it all has a deep, real interest for me."
Herbert Hoover, deeply interested. The Chinese government-owned mining company had resisted Buick Moring's attempts to obtain an ownership share in certain Chinese mines, but instead had accepted a high-interest loan, with Hoover to serve as technical advisor to Chang Yen Mao, the Director General of China's mining company. Hoover inspected the mines and proposed new operations, with his ultimate goal being to secure his company's control of Chinese properties. Hoover proposed changes in Chinese mining law to allow increased foreign participation, and Chang, hoping to wet his beak, supported the efforts. But China was moving in the opposite direction. In late 1899, the Boxer Rebellion, an uprising against foreign, colonial, and Christian influence, broke out in China. The Hoovers lived in Tientsin, a city near Beijing, in a compound for foreigners. In June 1900, Boxer rebels were joined by Chinese government troops in laying siege to Tientsin's foreign compound and Beijing's legation quarter. Hoover helped build barricades, and Lou carried a pistol and volunteered at a makeshift hospital. While they awaited the arrival of a relief force sent into China by an allegiance of 8 nations, including the United States, Hoover took advantage of the chaos to negotiate a massive business deal that would later be called, quote, "the largest transfer of property to foreigners in the history of China." Chang, believing the Chinese government was on the verge of collapse and fearing that Chinese mines would be seized by Japan and Russia, agreed to reorganize the Chinese mining company into a joint Chinese-British venture, with Hoover backdating the agreement to make it look like it was entered into before the uprising. When the relief force liberated Tientsin, Hoover sallied forth to act as a guide and would carry a rifle. When the smoke cleared from the rebellion, Chang attempted to back out of the deal, and Hoover accused him of reneging and confronted him in a protracted, quote, 4 days row that produced a renegotiated memorandum that would give the Chinese more money and equal control of the company.
Upon securing Chang's agreement, Hoover recalled that he then took control of the Chinese mining company's title deeds and cash reserves, quote, "by main force and by violence." That's Hoover's own words. Buick Moreland proceeded to ignore the renegotiated terms, registering the new enterprise as a British company, distributing massive amounts of free shares to Buick associates, and rather than injecting new capital as it had agreed to do, took out huge loans in the company's name to finance its operations. Hoover returned to London and was made a partner in Buick Moreland. He publicly claimed that his salary was $33,000 per year, but he confessed to his brother that his financial position was heavily leveraged on the outcome of the Chinese deal. His prospects were further threatened when it came to light that a Buick partner had sold massive amounts of fraudulent stock to cover speculative losses, and the other partners had to assume liability for the debt. The Hoovers lived in London, but Hoover's work continued to take him on travels across the globe, including Australia and South Africa. During these years, Lou gave birth to 2 sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan, and Hoover suffered a pair of nervous breakdowns brought on by stress and overwork. Lou would say, quote, "If you want to get the gloomiest view on any subject on earth, ask Bert about it."
Wow. Seemingly dark times for Herbert Hoover.
He's got a lot on his plate.
Indeed. The Chinese company sued Buick Moreland in British court and won, with Buick being ordered to honor the renegotiated memorandum or have that entire deal voided. Hoover tried to get out of his partnership with the firm, and by 1908, claiming that he wanted to retire due to consumption of the brain, he secured its agreement to buy him out in exchange for him signing a 10-year non-compete covenant. Hoover is going to go into business as an independent mining consultant and financier, specializing in rescuing distressed mining operations through corporate restructuring and capital injections, describing himself as an, quote, engineering doctor to sick concerns. He was making over $100,000 a year, and he continued to get richer. Investing in new methods of extracting zinc from zinc ore, he formed the hugely successful Zinc Corporation. He learned of potential mines deep in the jungles of Burma and developed them in part by building a 55-mile railroad and 2-mile underground tunnel, ending up with an extremely lucrative silver and lead mining operation.
Hoover would settle a suit filed against him by Buick Moreland for breaching his non-compete agreement, but he was now a multimillionaire. He sat on the board of 18 companies and was recognized as one of the world's premier mining engineers. He gave a series of lectures at Stanford and Columbia University, which he collected and published in a book, Principles of Mining. He and Lou collaborated to publish the first English-language translation of a classic text on mining and metallurgy, published in Latin in 1556.
Impressive.
Yeah, very much. Though Hoover was rather blunt and unsociable, the Hoovers constantly entertained guests from all over the world at their London home, and they also took many lavish vacations. Hoover felt that he had conquered the world of the mining business and was casting about for new challenges. Though he had spent so much time abroad, he was staunchly American at heart and missed his homeland. He was considering some avenue of public service, with a friend writing to recommend him to President William Howard Taft as a man who, quote, possesses the greatest talent for executive service and a man who will make himself felt. Hoover turned down the deanship of Columbia's mining school and became a trustee at Stanford, and he shopped around for a California newspaper to buy with an eye toward wielding William Randolph Hearst-like influence. In the summer of 1914, he was preparing to move his family to San Francisco when an unexpected call to public service was suddenly thrust upon him in the form of a world war.
That's just it. We'll see how Herbert Hoover's going to handle it right after these messages.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Crucian Salts, which has an important message for our bigger listeners. If you're fat, remove the cause. Crucian salts contain the 6 universal salts that your bodily organs, nerves, and glands need to function properly. When your vital organs fail to perform their work correctly, your bowels and kidneys can't throw off waste material, and before you realize it, you're growing hideously fat. Take half a teaspoonful of Crucian salts in a glass of hot water every morning, and cut out pastry and fatty meats, go light on potatoes, butter, cream, and sugar, And in 3 weeks, get on the scales and note how many pounds of fat have vanished. One woman recently lost 20 pounds of fat with Crucian salts. She lost her double chin, her prominent hips, and her sluggishness, and gained physical vigor, vivaciousness, and a shapely figure. Get a 4-week supply of Crucian salts for just 85 cents. If the first bottle doesn't convince you that this is the easiest, safest, and surest way to lose fat, your money will be gladly returned. Listeners, have you become so morbidly obese from routinely shoveling such huge quantities of junk food into your insatiable maw that your internal organs are practically shutting down? Don't worry. You can start to undo the damage you've done to yourself by using Crucian salts and laying off the sweetmeats. Before you know it, the fat will be melting away as if it were the butter you used to guzzle. For the ladies, it's simple. Trade your cookies and cakes for some Crucian salts, and you'll trade your bulky hips and multiple chins for a slender, shapely figure. That's a message from our sponsor, Crucian Salts.
Now, a message from our sponsor, Ironized Yeast. Nobody loves a skinny woman. Don't be skinny, washed out, tired, and unattractive. Gain weight quickly with Ironized Yeast. Folks are amazed, saying they've gained 5 to 15 pounds in a few weeks. Ironized yeast makes a new person of you. Skinny limbs are quickly covered with rounded, graceful flesh. Ugly hollows in shoulders are filled up. Sallow, pimply skin becomes pink and satiny smooth. If you are underweight, nervous, or tired, you need Ironized Yeast. It's how skinny, lifeless girls gain weight. Pleasant-tasting tablets in a handy bottle, it never upsets the stomach or causes gas or bloating. Go to any druggist today and get a full-size treatment of Ironized Yeast and use it all. If after this generous trial you are not delighted with your improvement, we'll give you your money back instantly. Ladies, these days, you have to walk a fine line between being repulsively fat and being disgustingly skinny. It may not be fair, but it's true. If you want to thread that needle and be worthy of love, you might want to try Ironized Yeast. If your shriveled, emaciated figure is naturally skeletal, or if you just overdid it with Crucian salts and need to balance yourself out, Ironized Yeast is the way to go. It's cheap, easy, and doesn't involve any of the loud, offensive flatulence caused by other weight-gain methods. With Ironized Yeast, you can say goodbye to your gaunt, malnourished appearance and put a little junk in your trunk, but not too much. That's a message from our sponsor, Ironized Yeast.
We're also proud to be sponsored by Dr. William McKay Davidson, England's foremost sex psychologist, who is proud to present Secrets of Love, a study of love and sex life now showing at the Waldorf Theater for women only. All seats just 50 cents. Sex mysteries will be unveiled by Dr. Davidson, whose work is based on the confessions of 10,000 husbands and wives in the only scientific exposé of true marriage ever presented, featuring motion pictures, human charts, and living models. Why do some women always attract men? Find out at Dr. Davidson's Secrets of Love. Ladies, these days women are concerned with one overriding question. How do I get and keep a man? We know an essential part of the answer is using any means necessary to avoid being either too fat or too skinny, but there's more to it than that, and that's where Dr. Davidson comes in. Armed with scientific research gleaned from 10,000 erotic confessions, he'll reveal sex secrets so steamy that men aren't even allowed in the room when you ladies hear them. After learning Dr. Davidson's Secrets of Love, you'll be so well versed in forbidden carnal knowledge that you'll have no trouble in snaring the man of your dreams. That's a message from our sponsor, Dr. William McKay Davidson.
And now, back to the show.
And we're back. We left Herbert Hoover at the outbreak of the First World War. When the European powers began declaring war on one another, over 100,000 American citizens who had been traveling in Europe became trapped there. Banks and hotels were shut down. Railroads and ships were commandeered for military use. Hoover's own family voyage to California was canceled when the ship was taken out of civilian service. And with thousands of stranded Americans converging on London, Hoover appeared at the U.S. consulate and volunteered to lead a relief effort. Calling together his fellow wealthy American businessmen, he established the Committee of American Residents in London for the Assistance of American Travelers. He and his friends offered their own money as financial aid to stranded Americans until Congress appropriated funds, and Hoover took autocratic control to arrange for lodging, medical care, and transportation. Within 2 months, 120,000 Americans had passed through London back to the U.S. The American ambassador wrote to Hoover, quote, "I count ourselves exceedingly fortunate in having your committee at our service. We couldn't have done the job without it."
Impressive stuff. Well, Germany is going to kick off its invasion of France by carving a path through neutral Belgium in a brutal campaign that soon becomes known as the Rape of Belgium, and which garners the Belgians' great sympathy from the neutral United States. Britain placed Germany under naval blockade, including German-occupied Belgium, and Belgium, with a population of 7.5 million and heavily dependent on food imports, soon ran out of food. Some Belgians tried to secure a food shipment from Britain, but the British government was reluctant to grant an exception to the blockade and insisted that the neutral United States supervise the shipment. Britain was of the opinion that it was the duty of the German occupiers to feed Belgium, and that Allied aid would only relieve Germany of its burden and risk the provisions being commandeered for German military use. Hoover leapt into the relief effort, submitting to the U.S. ambassador in London a comprehensive plan to aid Belgium and warning the British government that it risked losing American public opinion if it let Belgium starve. He secured approval for the creation of the Commission for the Relief of Belgium as a private charitable organization with himself as chairman. Hoover launched massive fundraising efforts, massive food purchases, a public relations offensive to generate sympathy for the Belgians' plight, and a personal diplomatic campaign. He persuaded the British Prime Minister that not only was aiding Belgium the right thing to do, but that a starving Belgium might end up collaborating with the German war effort out of pure desperation. Hoover then traveled to Berlin, where the German Chancellor expressed gratitude for the relief effort, but refused to withdraw a demand that Belgium pay Germany an indemnity. The British government agreed to offer loans to Belgium's government in exile that would be used to buy food, and the French and American governments would eventually be providing funding as well. Hoover oversaw an organization that had tens of thousands of volunteers, bought almost $2 million worth of food per week, and operated a fleet of dozens of ships and hundreds of barges. In 1915, his operations expanded to include aid to 2 million French citizens in German-occupied French territory, and he had a budget of $150 million. The U.S. ambassador to Britain said, quote, "The Commission for the Relief of Belgium is Hoover and absolutely depends on Hoover, who has personally made arrangements with the governments concerned and has carried these delicate negotiations through only because of his high character and unusual ability."
Pretty impressive.
Indeed.
Hoover achieved international recognition and enjoyed a form of diplomatic immunity, with the British authorizing him to cross the Channel despite its blockade, and Germany issuing him a pass that said, quote, "This man is not to be stopped anywhere under any circumstances." The Commission's ships flew their own flag, and it was the only flag respected by all of the belligerents. When the German military governor of Belgium tried to interfere with his efforts, Hoover appealed to Berlin and threatened to withdraw the relief, and the military governor was ordered to back down.
That's some pretty wild stuff there.
Mm-hmm. The British Admiralty, believing the relief effort undermined the effectiveness of its blockade, tried to discredit Hoover by launching an inquiry into his German business connections, but he was cleared of any wrongdoing. On a visit to Washington, D.C., he met with President Woodrow Wilson, who wrote that Hoover was, quote, one of the very ablest men we have sent over there and a great international figure. In 2.5 years, the commission shipped 2.5 million tons of food and spent $200 million, with very little going to administrative overhead. A British cabinet member said it was, quote, an absolute miracle of scientific organization. Every pound of food and supplies is accounted for. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, Hoover, no longer a citizen of a neutral power, stepped aside from the commission and left it in the hands of neutral Dutch and Spanish authorities.
That's it. Hoover is going to look to parlay his success into a major role in the U.S. war effort, even suggesting in a letter to a top Wilson advisor that a new cabinet-level position should be created to run the U.S. efforts in Europe, and hinting that he was the man for the job. Wilson asked Hoover to chair a powerless advisory committee on U.S. food supplies, but Congress was considering a bill to give the executive branch extraordinary powers over the national food supply. Hoover hired a press agent to promote the importance of food to the war effort and lobbied Wilson and Congress to install a single administrator rather than a committee to run the effort. After a White House meeting, Hoover issued a press release saying, quote, my only desire is to see the proper instrumentality set up to meet this, one of our greatest emergencies, and a man of courage, resource, and experience at its head, who is willing to sacrifice himself on the altar of the inarticulate masses whom he must protect. Those are some
choice words.
Well thought words on the part of Herbert Hoover.
Hoover, not a politician, not a populist.
That's it. With congressional approval, Wilson creates the U.S. Food Administration and he appoints Hoover to run it. He's charged with providing food for American allies abroad while maintaining stable domestic prices and preventing domestic shortages, hoarding, and monopolies. He avoided instituting formal rationing and minimized the need to invoke coercive executive powers by launching a public relations campaign that used patriotic appeals to call for voluntary participation in a national effort to increase production and avoid waste, with advertising firms producing posters and slogans like, "Food is ammunition, don't waste it," and "Food will win the war." Half of America's housewives signed pledges to follow Food Administration directives, and Americans were encouraged to save food by having meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and sweetless Saturdays, while still trying to keep Taco Tuesdays.
Taco Tuesdays were sacrosanct, even in wartime.
Hooverizing became a verb, and Hoover became a hero of the progressive movement for displaying administrative efficiency, cooperative humanitarianism, and independence from party politics. Hooverizing becoming a verb here, pretty positive. There's some other verbs going to be applied to Hoover in the future that might not be so positive, but that remains to be seen.
Yep, things are going pretty good for him at this point. He launches into the fray to avert a looming flour shortage, creating a federal grain corporation to acquire and sell wheat at a low fixed price, a move that prompted protests from wheat farmers who refused to sell their produce, prompting Hoover to import wheat from Canada. The U.S. substantially increased its food production, and in the first year of the war, doubled its food exports to Europe, ultimately shipping 23 million tons of food to the Allied powers. In the summer of 1918, Hoover traveled to Europe to spread the word that a bountiful American harvest would keep the Allies well supplied. Colonel Edward House, Wilson's top advisor, felt that the good news, quote, should be used as propaganda to stimulate the morale amongst the Allies and to depress that of the Germans, but he felt that Hoover going in person was a shameless act of self-promotion by, quote, the greatest living advertiser. House confided to his diary, quote, I have never known a man with a less sympathetic personality.
Ouch. Well, by November 1918, the war was won, and Wilson had a new task for Hoover, appointing him to head the new American Relief Administration, charged with providing humanitarian relief to the suffering people of Europe where food supplies were low, and Hoover estimated 400 million people were facing starvation, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Hoover had a surplus of food left over from the war, and he engaged thousands of U.S. Army officers to serve as his agents throughout Europe. Germany and Austria-Hungary were still under British blockade pending the outcome of peace negotiations, and Britain and France did not want Allied food aid going to those countries. Congressional funding for the ARA prohibited its money being spent on enemy countries, but with Wilson's tacit support, Hoover used a Byzantine maze of middlemen to obscure his transactions, ultimately sending 42% of his food aid to Germany and Austria-Hungary. He was in Paris during the Versailles peace negotiations, and he deplored the punitive terms being imposed on Germany, believing they would cripple the European economy and lead to another war. In less than 9 months, Hoover distributed $1.1 billion in food and supplies and used his budget surplus to establish the European Children's Fund, which would go on to provide food, clothing, and medicine to 15 million impoverished children. By 1921, Hoover had moved on to a cabinet position, but he was still technically the head of the ARA when famine struck Soviet Russia, which had a communist government since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. The U.S. did not recognize the Soviet government and still aided anti-communist forces in the ongoing Russian Civil War, and many Americans were not inclined to extend a hand to starving Russians, but Herbert Hoover was adamant, saying, quote, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. The ARA would go on to feed 10 million people per day in Russia, as well as providing clothing and medicinal supplies. Millions died in the Russian famine, but millions more were saved by the American-led relief efforts. One Soviet writer told Hoover, quote, your help will enter history as a unique, gigantic achievement, worthy of the greatest glory, which will long remain in the memory of millions of Russians whom you have saved from death.
Wow. Hoover's wartime humanitarian successes earned him national and international acclaim, which he hoped would carry him into the presidency in 1920. With President Wilson debilitated by a stroke, the presidential field was wide open on both sides of the aisle. Hoover was not a member of either party and had never participated in electoral politics. He had nominally joined a Republican club in 1909, but he supported Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 progressive candidacy, and he was closely associated with the Democratic Wilson administration. Hoover initially did not make a move to join a party, naively hoping that his reputation for humanitarianism and ultra-competent administration would prompt one or the other party to draft him as its presidential candidate. One ambitious Democrat, Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin D. Roosevelt, said, quote, people are more and more seeming to get away from the old political stuff and to be insisting upon a practical business administration of government affairs. Of course, Hoover, of all candidates, is more ideally fitted for this particular line of administrative work than any other. FDR's friends promoted the idea of a Hoover-Roosevelt Democratic ticket. But ultimately, Hoover felt the Democratic Party had no chance in the upcoming election and declared himself a Republican. But he lacked political connections, a coherent strategy, or an effective campaign organization. He attracted no support from old-guard conservative Republicans due to his progressive bent, his disdain for machine politics, and his support for U.S. entry into Wilson's favored League of Nations. Hoover competed in the primary election in his adopted home state of California, where his family had just built a lavish mansion, but he was trounced by California Senator Hiram Johnson. At the Republican National Convention, Hoover placed 13th on the first ballot, receiving between 4 and 6 delegates, until he peaked on the 10th ballot with 10 delegates. The nomination went to Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding, with Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge selected as his running mate.
That's it. Hoover is dismayed by his poor showing, and he resolves to learn from it. With his eyes still on a future presidency, he would begin building connections in the Republican establishment from his base in California. He supported Harding's candidacy and sent him a letter indicating that he was open to any suggestion as to how I could be of service. They kept up a correspondence, and after Harding crushed Democrat James M. Cox in the general election, he invited Hoover to his home in Marion, Ohio. Hoover wanted to be Secretary of State, but his support for the League of Nations disqualified him with conservative Republicans. Harding admired Hoover and offered him Secretary of Commerce, considered among the least prestigious cabinet posts. Hoover accepted, but the Republican Senate didn't want him, and Harding had to buck his former Senate colleagues by insisting they accept Hoover as a condition for his naming conservative favorite Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary.
Hoover entering the cabinet, he takes an expanded view of the lowly Commerce Department, believing that it has oversight over the entire economy, and noting that its Enabling Act authorized him to, quote, foster, promote, and develop the foreign and domestic commerce, the mining, manufacturing, shipping, and fishing industries, and the transportation facilities of the United States. His activities would be so wide-ranging that some began to call him the Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of everything else. He reorganized his department, sweeping out political hacks and appointing educated professionals. He improved the collection of economic data, which had previously been scattered and unreliable. He had a major focus on improving efficiency and productivity through standardization, holding hundreds of conferences with different industry participants to encourage cooperation. His first success, which received wide publicity, was an agreement among paving brick manufacturers to reduce the varieties of bricks from 66 to 11. Similar efforts reduced the variety of mattress sizes from 78 to 4, varieties of milk bottles from 49 to 9, and milk bottle caps from 29 to 1. Well, it's pretty impressive. Some we take for granted today. You can go buy a mattress and it's going to fit your bed frame. Before Hoover, there were 78 different sizes you had to deal with.
Yeah.
86 industries adopted simplified practices, resulting in $600 million in savings for consumers.
Those are some pretty big numbers. Harding is going to take office in the midst of a deep post-war recession, and Hoover successfully urges him to call a national conference on unemployment. There, Hoover said, quote, "There is no economic failure so terrible in its import as that of a country possessing a surplus of every necessity of life in which numbers, willing and anxious to work, are deprived of these necessities. It simply cannot be if our moral and economic system is to survive." The conference recommended shorter work hours, job sharing, local employment agencies, and urging state and local governments to fast-track public works projects. Hoover worked with Harding to pressure the steel industry to abolish the 12-hour workday, drafting a public letter for Harding's signature that succeeded in shaming the industry into reform. He sent agents all over the world to scout opportunities for imports and exports. He helped negotiate the Colorado River Compact, an agreement between 7 states over water rights on the Colorado River, which would lead to increased irrigation and eventually to the Hoover Dam. He asserted federal authority over the new aviation industry, inspecting planes, licensing pilots, and regulating runways, an effort that would later evolve into the Federal Aviation Administration. with the number of households having a radio increasing by more than 3,000% during his cabinet tenure. He called a national radio conference and asserted federal control over radio broadcasting, an effort that would later evolve into the Federal Communications Commission. When Harding died in August 1923, Hoover was retained in the cabinet by the new president, Calvin Coolidge. He supported Coolidge's successful 1924 candidacy for a term in his own right, and thereafter tried to discern the inscrutable Coolidge's intentions for 1928.
Hoover still got his eye on the presidency. In the spring of 1927, Hoover was vocal about his position on how the U.S. should respond to a situation in China, a position that differed from that of Secretary of State Frank Kellogg. Coolidge felt that Hoover was promoting himself to replace Kellogg and told reporters, quote, "Mr. Kellogg isn't going to resign. If he does resign, Mr. Hoover will not be appointed Secretary of State." Hoover kept silent. And just weeks later, a major natural disaster struck when the Mississippi River flooded after severe rainstorms caused the water to rise to unprecedented levels, affecting 4 million acres and leaving 1.5 million people homeless. Urged by 6 state governors, Coolidge appointed Hoover to coordinate relief efforts. Comedian Will Rogers said, quote, "When a man is sick, he calls a doctor. But when the United States of America is sick, they call for Herbert Hoover."
Indeed, they did. Coolidge had been reluctant to have the federal government take responsibility, but Hoover was clear that, quote, "it is a national problem and must be solved nationally and vigorously." Hoover would set up his headquarters in Memphis, and he would coordinate tens of thousands of volunteers, using press and radio to help the Red Cross raise $17 million for the relief efforts. He coordinated efforts between the affected state governments, asking each governor to name a, quote, "dictator of resources." 150 tent cities were established as refugee camps with electricity, sewer lines, dining halls, and medical care. Coolidge praised Hoover by saying, quote, "Your work in the South has been of great service to that region, and thereby to the whole nation. I do not think of anyone else that was equipped to handle it as you have done."
High praise.
Indeed, and that's going to bring us to 1928. Republican nominations going to be coming up. Coolidge has been up in the air. What's going to happen here? Well, not too long after the flood situation in August 1927, Calvin Coolidge issues a pretty famous press release saying, quote, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928.
Well, Hoover is ready. He has a team of experienced establishment political operatives to campaign on his behalf, including powerful senators and party leaders, and he has few serious rivals for the Republican nomination. Charles Evans Hughes declines to run, and while Vice President Charles Dawes and former Illinois Governor Frank Loudon dipped their toe in the waters, they failed to gain traction. Hoover won most of the primary elections that he entered, and it seemed like the only thing that could derail his nomination was if Coolidge agreed to seek another term. Coolidge was lukewarm about Hoover, privately referring to him as Wonder Boy, and saying, quote, "For 6 years that man has given me unsolicited advice, all of it bad." Coolidge didn't discourage Hoover's campaign efforts and reiterated his intention not to run, but Hoover still worried that the Republican convention in Kansas City might try to draft Coolidge. A draft Coolidge movement did arise at the convention, but it never got off the ground, and Hoover won the nomination on the first ballot, receiving 837 votes, with his nearest competitors, Frank Loudon and Kansas Senator Charles Curtis, receiving just 74 and 64 respectively. The convention considered renominating Dawes for vice president, but he was despised by both Hoover and Coolidge, and the nomination went to Charles Curtis.
That's it, Charles Dawes. Of course, on our list of Worst vice presidents.
He rubbed some people the wrong way.
That's just it. The Democrats, on the other hand, are going to nominate New York Governor Al Smith, with Arkansas Senator Joseph Robinson as his running mate. The two-party platforms had little in the way of sharp policy differences, but Hoover and Smith were very different individuals. Smith was a career machine politician, smooth-talking, charismatic. He lacked formal education. Herbert Hoover was brusque, unsocial, and thought himself above politics. Al Smith is a Catholic, and his campaign suffers from anti-Catholic bigotry, with Hoover attempting to rise above the issue with statements in favor of religious tolerance. Smith is also going to suffer due to his open opposition to prohibition, which earned him the ire of powerful temperance lobbying groups. Hoover was not enamored of prohibition and often went for a cocktail at the Belgian embassy, which was exempt, but he issued a statement calling prohibition, quote, a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose, which was sufficiently ambiguous to placate both sides of the debate. Hoover is going to do little personal campaigning, mostly because it's not in his skill set, though he tries to project an aura of disinterestedness, as if he was reluctantly drafted into public service. At the urging of progressive Republican Senator William Borah of Iowa, Hoover expressed support for calling a special session of Congress following the inauguration to address agricultural relief, a move he hopes will cement his support among Western farmers and progressives.
He engages Madison Avenue advertising firms to help with public relations, resulting in slogans like, quote, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, associating Hoover with the unprecedented economic boom of the Harding-Coolidge years. That the Republican Party could take credit for the nation's prosperity was the deciding factor in an election that was never close. Hoover rode that wave to a landslide victory over Smith, winning the popular vote 58% to 41%, and the Electoral College 444 to 87. A crushing victory.
Indeed.
Hoover won 40 states and Smith only 8, with Hoover actually capturing several states in the Democratic Solid South, including Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Hoover's flood relief efforts in the South, as well as Smith's Catholicism and anti-prohibition views, helped Hoover to have more success in the South than any other Republican since the end of Reconstruction. Republicans also retained their majorities in both houses of Congress. Between Election Day and the inauguration, Hoover got out of Washington, D.C. and avoided politicians and office seekers by taking a 10-week, 10-country tour of Central and South America. Hopes were high for Hoover's presidency, with the San Francisco Chronicle predicting that, quote, he will drive so forcefully at the tasks now before the nation that at the end of his 8 years as president will find us looking back on an era of prodigious achievement.
Well, we'll see if those words hold up or if they age like milk after these messages. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by H.A. Almond, who is proud to announce that he has opened Marion, Ohio's newest real estate office. Offering service based on 20 years of experience with Marion Realty, H.A. Almond will send you home, will sell you a home, will rent you a home, will trade you a home, or will build and finance your home. Visit his offices at number 201, Marion County Bank Building. Listeners, if you're looking to make a move in the Marion real estate market, whether as a buyer or a seller, H.A. Almond is your man. He has such a firm grasp on Marion real estate that absolutely nothing gets by him. That's a message from our sponsor, H.A. Almond.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. H.A. Amen has just bought another ad on our show with a very urgent message. $500 reward. I will pay a reward of $500 in cash for the arrest and conviction of the 4 men who on the morning of May 16th, 1929, removed a small building from the premises at 928 Unkafer Avenue owned by me. Listeners, we are shocked at the scale of this brazen theft.
Shocked.
An entire building stolen right out from under H.A. Amen's nose. Apparently 4 men simply loaded the building onto a truck and carted it away. There's a hefty reward on the table for anyone who helps bring the culprits to justice. So if you happen to see 4 suspicious characters trying to appear nonchalant while hauling a small building in the greater Marion metro area, there's a strong chance those are the guilty parties. Don't believe any of the convoluted excuses they're likely to give about how this is a different building altogether. Just call the police immediately, and that $500 could be yours. That's a message from our sponsor, the dispossessed H.A. Amen.
Now a message from our sponsor, the Woodbury Forest School. $500 reward. A reward of $500 is offered by the Woodbury Forest School if the body of William Haynes, one of its students, is found in the Rappahannock River within 10 miles of Fredericksburg. A reward of $200 will be paid if the body is found elsewhere. Young William Haynes was drowned in the Rapidan River at Madison Mills on Friday, May 3rd. A careful search of the river and the vicinity of the accident has been made without result, and it is believed that the body may have been carried off by the current. Listeners, the Woodbury Forest School has lost one of its own and is prepared to shell out a nice chunk of change to recover the body and enable Mr. and Mrs. Haynes to give their son a proper Christian burial. Their best guess at this point is that William was swept all the way down the Rapidan and into the Rappahannock near Fredericksburg. They'll pay $500 if you can find him there, but only $200 if it's somewhere else. That means if you find William far afield from Fredericksburg, by my math, there's an extra $300 to be had should you bring him to Fredericksburg and pretend that's where he turned up. In fact, if you happened to acquire William's body some time ago and have been holding on to it, perhaps for the purpose of sexually violating it, the time to hand it over is now, and the most remunerative place to do so is Fredericksburg. That's a message from our sponsor, the Woodbury Forest School.
And now, back to the show. And we're back, ready to join Herbert Hoover as he embarks into the office of the presidency, the culmination of his excellent career, which will surely be the crown jewel in his life of uninterrupted achievement. Hoover sworn in on March 4th, 1929 by Chief Justice William Howard Taft. Giving his inaugural address amid a rainstorm, he said, quote, "Ours is a land rich in resources, stimulating in its glorious beauty, filled with millions of happy homes, blessed with comfort and opportunity. In no nation are the institutions of progress more advanced. In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. In no nation is the government more worthy of respect. No country is more loved by its people. I have an abiding faith in their capacity, integrity, and high purpose. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope."
There you have it. Things are looking bright with hope. Hoover's cabinet picks avoided career politicians in favor of highly educated, privileged elites from the business and professional realms. He appointed a steel executive and fellow engineer Robert Lamont to his old job as Commerce Secretary. Hoover's college classmate, Stanford University President Ray Wilbur, became Interior Secretary. For Navy Secretary, Hoover appointed Charles Francis Adams III, the great-grandson and great-great-grandson of the President's Adams, who was a successful lawyer and businessman and a champion yachtsman, though his only political experience was serving 2 years as mayor of Quincy, Massachusetts in the 1890s. For Treasury Secretary, Hoover retained Andrew Mellon, who had already served 8 years during the economic boom of the Harding and Coolidge administrations and who turned down, on the grounds that he was too old, requests by conservatives that he run against Hoover for the 1928 Republican presidential nomination. Hoover also retained James J. Davis, who already had 8 years as Labor Secretary. For Secretary of State, he sought to reappoint Charles Evans Hughes, who had served 4 years under Harding and Coolidge, but Hughes declined, and Hoover turned to Henry Stimson, the sitting Governor-General of the Philippines, who had been War Secretary under Taft and would later be War Secretary again under Hoover's successor. For Attorney General, Hoover named Coolidge's Solicitor General, William Mitchell. Noting the, quote, dangerous expansion in the criminal elements who have found enlarged opportunities in dealing with illegal liquor, Hoover transferred responsibility for enforcement of prohibition from the Treasury Department to the Justice Department, and also appointed a commission to conduct the first comprehensive national study of crime and policing. He proclaimed National Child Health Day, announced a major conference on child welfare, and commissioned a study by social scientists of living conditions throughout the United States. Hoover worked long hours, with one journalist referring to him as the first quote-unquote presidential industrialist, and his friend Vernon Kellogg, a Stanford scientist who worked on the Belgian relief effort, saying, quote, "The difference between Mr. Hoover and most other presidents is that he expends practically all of his time in his overalls down in the roundhouse, working desperately to repair the engines of civilization."
There you have it. Hoover, the expert engineer, tinkering with the engine of America.
That's it.
In April 1929, he called a special session of Congress, saying he did so, quote, to redeem 2 pledges given in the last election, farm relief and limited changes in the tariff. Past presidents had been wary of calling special sessions, with Coolidge recognizing them as opportunities for Congress to go hog wild with big spending pet projects, but Hoover, who was disdainful of practical politics, naively believed that Congress would tamely follow his lead. The proposed Agricultural Marketing Act, which would create a federal farm board to administer a marketing cooperative bolstered by farmer-provided funds, was quickly amended to provide large public payouts to farmers, reminiscent of a bill that Coolidge had twice vetoed and that Hoover had strongly opposed. Only the looming specter of another presidential veto caused the offensive provision to be removed, and Hoover signed the Agricultural Marketing Act on June 15th. However, a can of worms had been opened on the issue of tariffs. Hoover sought only limited tariff revisions directed at agricultural products and did not want industrial tariffs raised, but tariff revisions were most congressmen's favorite opportunity to cater to special interests in their own districts. In what one Hoover biographer called, quote, an orgy of log rolling, the House produced a bill to massively increase industrial tariffs across the board. The Senate version dialed back industrial tariffs and focused on agriculture, but, led by Senator Borah, it inserted once again the provision for payouts to farmers that had been stripped from the agriculture bill, and removed a provision cherished by Hoover that would give the president increased flexibility to adjust tariff rates. These events revealed to Hoover the extent to which the Republican Senate majority was held in the balance by a handful of Western progressive Republicans who had their own agenda. Hoover failed to take a strong stand one way or another, and one Republican congressman was baffled by Hoover's ignorance of the legislative process, saying, quote, he didn't know where the votes came from. Far from being resolved in the special session, the tariff debate would drag on all the way into the summer of 1930, by which time a major economic disaster had struck.
That's just it. Now, Hoover had been concerned about stock market speculation since his days as Commerce Secretary. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, measuring the New York Stock Exchange, had risen from about 80 in 1921 to 150 by 1927, and it increased sharply to over 300 by the time of Hoover's inauguration. Much of the stock purchasing was done with borrowed money, a risky business that depended on the stock rising to enable the loan to be paid off. The federal government had little power over the stock market. There was as yet no Securities and Exchange Commission, and the New York Stock Exchange was a New York State entity subject to regulation, if any, by the state government. The Federal Reserve Board's power to set interest rates could affect speculation by limiting credit, and the Fed raised rates in 1926 and 1928, but failed to put a curb on speculation. Upon taking office as president, Hoover prompted the Fed to pressure New York banks against making loans to stockbrokers, called the president of the New York Stock Exchange an asshole. Called the president of the New York Stock Exchange to the White House to lecture him about speculation, and wrote a statement to be released by Mellon advising investors to favor bonds over stocks. But the stock market continued to rise, peaking on September 3rd, 1929, at a record high of 381. It would not be that high again until Willie Nelson and Snoop Dogg showed up 25 years later. That's obviously a joke, but it, in all honesty, would not be that high again for 25 years. The panic would begin on October 24th, Black Thursday, when the market lost 11% of its value at the opening bell. On October 28th and 29th, Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market dropped by 23%, closing at 230. By mid-November, it had fallen below 200. Economists and historians still debate whether the stock market crash caused the depression or was a byproduct of it, and at the time, it was unclear whether the economy was still fundamentally sound despite the crash. In November, the Fed reported to Hoover that the market readjustment would go on for several more months, and as he later recalled, quote, "The primary question at once arose as to whether the President and the federal government should undertake to mitigate and remedy the evils." Andrew Mellon believed that if the natural laws of economics were allowed to take their course, the economy would hit bottom and, quote, "purge the rottenness out of the system, enabling it to rebound more quickly." But Hoover believed that government policies could counteract the economic cycle, and he leapt at the opportunity to confront a crisis.
Like Will Rogers said, when America's sick, they call Herbert Hoover. And he's got a prescription for this crisis. In late November, Hoover held a series of White House conferences with major industry, labor, agriculture, and utility leaders, in which he noted that previous recessions were accompanied by layoffs and cuts to wages and cuts to business spending, and he argued that the crisis could be averted by maintaining wages and increasing spending. With Hoover appealing to their patriotism and good citizenship, industries largely complied with his directives and maintained high wages and spending. A top banker protested that, quote, "It is not true that high wages make for prosperity. Instead, prosperity makes high wages." While some employees who kept their jobs continued to enjoy high wages, many businesses that were unable to adjust suffered from reduced profits and could not expand or create new jobs, and other businesses were forced to close altogether. Unemployment increased from 3% before the crash to 9% by early 1930. Hoover moved to increase federal public works spending to new highs and leaned on the states to do the same. He condemned, quote, "illegitimate speculation in the stock market," and speculators were investigated and prosecuted, prompting stock traders to attempt to self-regulate the market in an effort to stave off government intervention, leading to a situation of fear and uncertainty. The stock market had rallied in late 1929, rising back up to 280 by March 1930, but then entered into a long decline that would take it below 150 a year later.
That's it, and as the economic clouds darkened, Hoover urges Congress to contemplate its tariff legislation. The final bill, known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, was passed in June 1930. It was the highest tariff in U.S. history, raising average rates on agricultural products from 38% to 49%, and on industrial products from 31% to 34%, and including the provision giving the president flexibility to adjust rates in conjunction with the bipartisan tariff commission. An open letter signed by over 1,000 economists urged Hoover to veto the bill, arguing that it would increase prices for American consumers and decrease American exports by prompting foreign countries to pass retaliatory tariffs. Tom Lamont, head of the J.P. Morgan Bank, later recalled, quote, "I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Smoot-Hawley tariff. I offered to suck his cock." But Hoover signed the bill, arguing that it was a necessary compromise between competing interests and believing that the flexibility provisions gave, quote, "great hope of taking the tariff away from politics, lobbying, and log rolling." European nations and Canada indeed retaliated with protective tariffs of their own, and American imports and exports declined. Europe was mired in economic depression as well, and its inability to sell its products in the United States made it more difficult for European nations to make payments on their war debts to the U.S.
That's right, Europe in a lot of trouble at this point as well. This depression going worldwide. Now, the stock market went up somewhat during the summer of 1930, and Hoover was optimistic that the nation was now on the road to recovery, only to experience another decline in the months preceding the 1930 midterm elections. The Democratic National Committee was operating a well-oiled public relations effort to blame Hoover and the Republicans for the nation's economic woes, popularizing the term Hooverville to describe the shanty towns of the destitute. Democrats would take control of the House, gaining more than 50 seats, and the Republican Senate majority was reduced to just one seat. Upon learning the results, Hoover told an advisor, quote, "It looks bad." Democratic New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt was reelected in a landslide, a victory which marked him out as a frontrunner for the next Democratic presidential nomination.
Well, in November and December 1930, the economic situation is made even worse by two major bank failures. Caldwell and Company, the largest banking chain in the South, and the Bank of United States, not the Bank of the United States, a major New York bank with many working-class immigrant customers. Major banks were also failing in Germany and Austria, and Hoover proposed a one-year moratorium on German war reparations payments, coupled with a moratorium on payments of Allied debts owed to the U.S., believing it might lead to a, quote, "general reestablishment of courage and confidence." He obtained congressional approval for the proposal, but France agreed only reluctantly and made it clear that it expected Germany to resume reparations payments the following year, which limited the effect of the moratorium to restore confidence in Germany's financial condition. Europe's problems persisted, with Germany collapsing and Britain abandoning the gold standard. In 1931, Hoover sought to stave off U.S. bank failures by creating the National Credit Corporation, a voluntary association of banks supposed to join together in providing loans to salvage distressed banks. But banks were unenthusiastic about participating, and in his December 1931 State of the Union address, Hoover proposed the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government entity that would use public money to do the job the private banks were reluctant to do. Congress obliged, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation would provide $1.5 billion in loans during 1932 and would be expanded by Hoover's successor. As head of the RFC, Hoover named former Vice President Charles Dawes, who served ably until he resigned to return to Chicago to rescue his family's failing bank, which would itself receive an RFC loan that was called into question by Democrats, who would enact a provision requiring future RFC loan recipients to be made public, a provision which discouraged some businesses from taking necessary loans because they did not want to be exposed as weak.
Situation's getting pretty dicey.
Indeed.
Hoover created the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, which focused on coordinating state and local efforts but did not provide federal welfare payments to the unemployed. Unemployment continued to rise, reaching 15% by the end of 1931 and 20% by mid-1932. The stock market fell below 100 by the end of 31. Throughout these years, several months of decline would be followed by a month or two of growth, prompting repeated false hopes that the worst was past and the nation was on the road back to prosperity. In the summer of 1932, Hoover successfully proposed the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, a $1 billion public works bill, and the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which created federal home loan banks that would provide liquidity to other banks and institutions to finance home mortgages. Hoover also supported a $150 million recapitalization of the federal land bank system, as well as the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932, which expanded the collateral acceptable for Federal Reserve banks to make loans to other banks, not to be confused with the much more famous Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which barred banks from engaging in both investment banking and commercial banking.
Indeed, you don't want to get those two mixed up on a quiz.
Yep. All this new federal spending, combined with lessened tax revenues due to the economic downturn, promised to result in a big federal budget deficit. Hoover appeared in the Senate in person for the first time in his presidency to demand congressional action on the deficit. Congress passed and Hoover signed the Revenue Act of 1932, which doubled the estate tax, created a new gift tax, raised corporate taxes by 15%, and raised the top marginal income tax rate from 25% to 63%. Andrew Mellon, who had resigned as Treasury Secretary by this time and been named ambassador to Britain, publicly supported the tax increase, but privately he said that, quote, industry and commerce were in no condition to bear additional burdens. It was largely a massive tax increase on the wealthy, but at a time of economic stagnation, that meant it was a massive tax increase on those who might be able to expand businesses and create new jobs. In the summer of 1932, unemployment approached 25%, and the stock market fell below 50.
Wow.
Ouch.
Not looking too good at home. Well, let's see where we are in the international arena. Herbert Hoover is a major proponent of disarmament, in part because he considers the $5 billion annually spent on arms across the world is a, quote, gigantic waste. With the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, the Harding administration had secured the agreement of the world's top naval powers to limit their number of capital ships. The Coolidge administration sought to extend the limitations to mid-sized ships at the 1927 Geneva Naval Conference, but no agreement was reached. In 1930, another conference was held in London that resulted in the London Naval Treaty, which successfully imposed limits on mid-sized ships and submarines, and was signed by the U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. Hoover called the agreement, quote, the final abolition of competition in naval arms between the greatest naval powers, and the burial of the fears and suspicions which have been the constant product of rival warship production. And he argued that it would result in savings of more than $2 billion. Hoover urged that the disarmament movement be expanded to land forces and made broad disarmament proposals at the Geneva Disarmament Conference in 1932. Though this idea failed to gain traction and the conference resulted in no agreement, especially after Germany's new leader, Adolf Hitler, withdrew Germany from the talks.
Adolf Hitler, not known for his disarmament stances.
Right.
In September, speaking of not being known for disarmament, in September 1931, a Japanese railroad in Chinese Manchuria was struck by an explosion which Japan blamed on Chinese nationalists, and which China said was a false flag event staged by the Japanese military as an excuse to occupy Manchuria, which it proceeded to do. Japan's actions violated the League of Nations Covenant and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, but the League of Nations was wholly ineffective at resolving the situation. While the United States protested the Japanese invasion, Secretary of State Henry Stimson noted privately that the administration was determined, quote, not to allow under any circumstances anybody to deposit the Manchurian baby on our lap. With so many problems at home, Hoover dismissed the idea of an economic blockade, later writing that, quote, neither our obligation to China, nor our own interest, nor our dignity requires us going to war. Hoover's solution was to announce that the U.S. refused to recognize any Japanese claims on Manchurian territory or any treaty that might be forced on China at gunpoint. Though it became known as the Stimson Doctrine, it was Hoover's idea.
Boy, with all this stuff going on, it could drive a man to drink. And that's going to bring us to Prohibition. By the time Hoover was elected, public opinion was beginning to question the Prohibition Amendment. Coolidge signed a bill increasing criminal penalties during his final days in office, and Hoover transferred responsibility for enforcement from the Treasury Department to the Justice Department, and commissioned a study of the issue. In January 1931, his commission issued a report acknowledging that, quote, there is yet no adequate observance or enforcement of prohibition, and that alcohol consumption was increasing among women and young people. But the commission was divided on what to do about it, with its 11 members split between repealing prohibition, revising it, or continuing as is. Hoover stood behind continued enforcement even though his efforts to step up enforcement had failed. The issue was fraught with political danger as support from temperance lobbying groups had helped him get elected, but overall public opinion was wavering. The Democratic Party was now moving more openly towards favoring repeal. While Hoover doubted the efficacy of prohibition, the temperance movement had strong roots in the Quaker community of his upbringing, and he felt duty-bound to stand by them. When the 1932 Republican National Convention was drafting the party platform, Hoover threatened to refuse the nomination if the convention supported repeal, and he deplored its vague compromise position of supporting revision of the Prohibition Amendment. He said, quote, all my life I have been connected with the God-fearing people of this country, and I feel now that I have made a decision which will affront them and make them feel that I have betrayed them. The Democratic platform supported repeal, and during the lame duck period after Hoover lost the election, spoiler alert, Congress proposed the 21st Amendment, which would repeal the 18th Amendment when it was ratified by 3/4 of the states in December 1933.
You can crack open a bottle to celebrate.
Indeed you can. Thanks, Hoover.
Yep. Well, that's going to bring us to another group of people who will be sarcastically thanking Hoover, the Bonus Army. The World War Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924 promised to provide bonuses to World War veterans in the form of a pension to be made payable in 1945. During the Depression, veterans lobbied for the bonus to be paid early or for legislation allowing them to borrow against it. Hoover and Congress both opposed such measures, believing that veterans constituted a small segment of those suffering from the Depression and that paying the bonuses now would break the budget and prevent wider relief measures. During the summer of 1932, a group of unemployed veterans and their families numbering over 10,000 gathered in Washington, D.C. to push for the bonuses. Hoover quietly had food, clothing, and supplies distributed to the bonus army camp, but there were fears that violence or rioting might break out, and an army intelligence report asserted that some of the demonstrators were communists bent on sparking an uprising.
Uh-oh.
In early July, Congress rejected a bill to distribute $2.5 billion in veterans' bonuses, and many of the demonstrators packed up and went home. There were rumors that a militant minority remaining behind intended to storm the White House, and after a small riot broke out when Washington, D.C. police sought to evict some demonstrators who were squatting in buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue, Hoover ordered the army to herd the demonstrators back into their main camp across the Anacostia River. However, the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, believed there was, quote, incipient revolution in the air, and after using tanks and tear gas to push the demonstrators back across the river, he ignored his orders and proceeded to drive the bonus army out of its main camp, which was set on fire. 135 veterans were arrested and 55 were injured. MacArthur held a press conference congratulating Hoover for taking firm action, saying, quote, had the president not acted within 24 hours, he would have been faced with a very grave situation.
That is something. Now, reports that the bonus army was rife with communists and career criminals may have been exaggerated, and Major Dwight Eisenhower later recalled that he had advised MacArthur against getting involved, saying, quote, I told that dumb son of a bitch not to go down there. Advisors close to the Democratic presidential nominee, Franklin Roosevelt, later claimed that upon hearing news of the bonus army debacle, FDR said, quote, this will elect me. Hoover biographer Kenneth White expresses doubt as to the authenticity of this story, noting that the Roosevelt campaign never made public use of the issue and arguing that it played no significant role in the election, with major newspapers being, quote, practically unanimous in expressing the opinion that President Hoover was justified in his course. Like Hoover, FDR did not support the bonuses and would continue to oppose them during his presidency. And that brings us right along to the election of 1932 coming up here, James.
That's right. Hoover had high hopes of being reelected, but things were not looking good. He had no challengers for the Republican nomination, but that may have been due in part because no potential challengers liked the party's chances against the Democrats. While many Republicans sympathized with Hoover's plight and believed he had been dealt a tough hand, the party was demoralized and suffered from lack of enthusiasm, with one of Hoover's top political advisors noting, quote, Republicans seem not to be trained to meet political adversity. They have been used to success nationally and have gotten away with the Republican prosperity talk. Now that they find adversity has come during a Republican administration, they do not know how to act. While the Democratic Party machine was firing on all cylinders, the Republican organization was lackluster, not helped by Hoover's poor relations with congressional Republicans. The Democratic National Convention nominated FDR on the fourth ballot over his rival, the 1928 nominee Al Smith. Hoover thought Smith would have been a tougher opponent and believed FDR was a weak candidate, an out-of-touch, wealthy socialite with a famous last name. One Hoover advisor said that FDR, quote, does not possess the imagination of leadership. He does not fit the picture. He is not what the hour demands. He will not pass muster. There is nothing to Franklin Roosevelt.
Oof, some harsh words. Well, Roosevelt's campaign aggressively blamed Hoover for the nation's economic woes, though it often issued contradictory messages, sometimes casting Hoover as a do-nothing president who ignored the plight of suffering Americans, and other times criticizing him for big spending, big government policies. In the end, FDR's message hit home, and Hoover could not escape being held responsible for the terrible economy. The stock market reached a new low of 41.2 in July of 1932. Unemployment was close to 25%, and gross domestic product was at $60 billion, down from $75 billion in 1931 and $105 billion in 1929. But Hoover retained belief in his chances, with some early fall polls seeming to indicate that he was in the lead, and he campaigned through a series of major radio addresses and speeches. He received a hostile reception, with crowds heckling him, throwing eggs and rotten fruit at his motorcade and train, and Secret Service agents detained a man who carried sticks of dynamite, and another who removed spikes from the railroad tracks in front of Hoover's train. By the end of his campaign tour, he was exhausted and demoralized. On Election Day, FDR won 57.4% of the popular vote, and Hoover 39.6%. FDR won the Electoral College 472 to 59, with Hoover winning only 6 states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Hoover would later write, quote, "Democracy is a harsh employer." And indeed it is.
And the American people said, "You're fired."
That's it.
But after you're told you're fired, there's still 4 months to go, because in early 1932, Congress proposed the 20th Amendment, which would shorten the lame duck period by moving the presidential inauguration from March 4th to January 20th, but it was not fully ratified until 1933 and would not apply until the next election cycle. Hoover's lame duck period would, in hindsight, be the lowest point of the nation's economic woes. He tried to advance new relief measures, but after his crushing electoral defeat, he had no moral authority, with the nation and the Democratic Congress already looking forward to the new FDR administration. Hoover tried to get FDR's support, but FDR largely ignored Hoover and refused to weigh in. Hoover would later accuse FDR of deliberately allowing the crisis to worsen during these months so he could swoop in and turn things around without having to share credit with Hoover. With the one-year moratorium on war debts and reparations set to expire, Britain and France proposed to cancel Germany's reparations, in light of Germany's inability and unwillingness to pay, on the condition that the U.S. forgive the Allied war debts. Hoover favored the proposal and formulated a plan to tie the debt forgiveness to limits on military spending, but the Democratic Congress failed to act, and FDR declined to cooperate with Hoover. Meanwhile, Hitler took power in Germany, and Japan announced its intention of leaving the League of Nations. Hoover's unreciprocated efforts to secure FDR's cooperation continued up to the day before the inauguration. After attending FDR's swearing-in on March 4th, 1933, Hoover left Washington and returned to California.
So, former President Herbert Hoover saying, "California, here I come." Not quite where he started from, but we'll see what he's able to do there right after these messages.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Bailey Radium Laboratories, who have an important message about Radithor, the only standardized and certified radium water produced in this country. The widespread prevalence of arthritis is a matter of grave national concern, as it incapacitates a large number of our population. It is by far the most serious problem facing the medical profession today. Science stood helpless before this destructive disease until the advent of radium. When the potent forces of radioactivity became commercially available, arthritis was definitively removed from the incurable group. Radithor radium water is not a drug, but it rather is the new modern weapon of medical science that is supplanting other methods of treatment for arthritis, rheumatism, and gout. Dr. Charles Morris states that at the London Radium Institute, even the severest types of arthritis are, quote, being cured with the utmost regularity. Call or write Bailey Radium Laboratories for a free 32-page booklet of clinical records and eminent medical authorities on the use of Radithor. Listeners, has arthritis got you down? Back in the olden days, there was nothing they could do for you, but the miracles of modern science have enabled you to completely cure your arthritis by the simple means of drinking copious amounts of radium-infused radioactive water. Radithor is a godsend. This booklet is mind-blowing. No one can read it without being convinced. I don't even suffer from joint pain, but they say an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, so I've been drinking Radithor every day just to be safe. I can see no reason why we all shouldn't do the same. That's a message from our sponsor, Bailey Radium Laboratories.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. New York City's chief medical examiner has issued an autopsy report indicating that Eben Myers, the wealthy iron manufacturer, died as a result of the effects of radium, which he absorbed from drinking Radithor, a radioactive water sold by Bailey Radium Laboratories. Myers apparently drank as many as 1,400 bottles of Radithor over the past 2 years, and it's being reported that perhaps 100 other wealthy men are suffering from radium poisoning contracted through the use of radioactive waters for the infusion of radium energy. The Federal Trade Commission has suppressed the sale of Radithor, and the American Medical Association has come forth with a blanket denouncement of the treatment as quackery, describing the purported booklet written by Dr. Charles Morris as, quote, so obviously a piece of commercial puffery that even the most unsophisticated can hardly be deceived. There you have it, listeners. The golden age of Radithor has come to an abrupt and ignominious end. Who could have imagined that drinking radioactive water would have detrimental side effects? Unfortunately, it appears that our sponsor, Bailey Radium Laboratories, was not the solid bastion of sound medical innovation that it passed itself off as. We here at the Dead President's Podcast sincerely apologize for hawking this toxic snake oil, and our thoughts and prayers go out to anyone who is taken in by this dangerous fad. This has not been a message from our former sponsor, Bailey Radium Laboratories.
I myself will be going to the hospital as soon as we finish this episode. But first, an important message from our sponsor, Climax Jumbo Peanuts. The finest peanut grown Climax Jumbo Peanuts are fresh roasted and available for only 20 cents a pound. Listeners, if you want the biggest, juiciest peanut around, look no further than Climax Jumbo Peanuts. Peanuts so good, you'll bust a nut. That's a message from our sponsor, Climax Jumbo Peanuts.
And now, back to the show.
And we're back, ready to follow Herbert Hoover out of the presidency and into his post-presidential life. He returns to Palo Alto and closely follows current events, becoming very critical of the Roosevelt administration. Rex Tugwell, a key member of the New Deal Brain Trust, would later write, quote, when it was all over, I once made a list of New Deal ventures begun during Hoover's years as Secretary of Commerce and then as President. The New Deal owed much to what he had begun. But despite this later acknowledgement, at the time, FDR's administration lambasted Hoover, blaming him for the Depression, characterizing him as indifferent to the suffering of Americans, and portraying the New Deal as a contrast to Hoover's supposedly failed policies. They also changed the name of the Hoover Dam to the Boulder Dam, rubbing it in. Hoover would become extremely critical of the New Deal, noting that its massive expansion of federal power and government intervention in the economy was, quote, a muddle of uncoordinated and reckless adventures that nevertheless failed to end the Depression. He compared the New Deal to Russian communism, Italian fascism, and German National Socialism, and argued that it was, quote, a radical departure from the foundations of 150 years which have made this the greatest nation in the world.
That's it. In 1934, he published an abstract critique of the New Deal called The Challenge to Liberty. In 1936, he hoped to win the Republican presidential nomination and, without overtly declaring his candidacy, gave many speeches intended to promote his availability. But the Republican Party was ready to move on, and he found no support. He was invited to give a speech at the convention, which was well received, but the nominee, Kansas Governor Alf Landon, declined Hoover's offer to campaign on his behalf. FDR would go on to crush Landon in the Electoral College, 531 to 8.
Ouch.
Hoover joined the board of directors at the New York Life Insurance Company and became national chairman of the Boys Clubs of America and helped it raise over $15 million. He would continue to criticize FDR, especially his 1937 plan to pack the Supreme Court, and gave a major speech in Chicago in which he embraced the label of conservative to describe the burgeoning movement against FDR's big government radicalism. The Depression continued until the Second World War and included a second major stock market crash in 1937. The quote-unquote Roosevelt recession saw unemployment once again reach 20% and the stock market dip below 100. In 1938, Hoover traveled to Europe, where he met with many national leaders, including Adolf Hitler, whom he concluded was quote-unquote partly insane, but also intelligent and not to be underestimated. In 1940, expecting FDR to retire after 2 terms, Hoover again sought the Republican nomination and again failed to gain any traction, finishing in 9th place on the first convention ballot. The nominee, Wendell Willkie, declined to have Hoover campaign on his behalf. There we have it again.
That's right. Nobody wants Hoover anymore. Hoover believed that FDR had unnecessarily entangled the United States in the widening Second World War and deplored his support for Stalin's Russia against Hitler's Germany, believing the U.S. should stand back and, quote, let those 2 bastards annihilate themselves. In January 1944, Lou Hoover suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 69. Her husband would go on to spend less time in California and establish his primary residence at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. After Harry Truman assumed the presidency upon FDR's death, he invited Hoover to the White House and asked him to help with European food relief. In 1946, Hoover was named honorary chairman of the President's Famine Emergency Committee, and though he served as a figurehead and advisor rather than an active administrator, he traveled throughout Europe and Asia, offering valuable advice and encouragement. In 1947, Truman appointed Hoover to lead a commission to consider administrative reorganization of the executive branch. The Hoover Commission would submit 19 reports to Congress and make 273 recommendations for administrative changes, about 100 of which were implemented, leading to the State Department Reorganization Act, the Military Unification Act, and the creation of the General Services Administration. Also in 1947, the Boulder Dam's name was changed back to the Hoover Dam.
There you have it.
Hoover back in business.
In 1949, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey urged Hoover to run for an open seat in the U.S. Senate, but the 75-year-old Hoover declined, saying that the Republican Party, quote, needs young blood. He didn't say whether or not it need to be the blood of virgins. In 1953, President Eisenhower appointed Hoover to lead another commission on executive reorganization, which would issue over 300 recommendations, with about half being implemented. He would decline offers from President Kennedy to chair advisory councils for the Peace Corps and the Food for Peace Initiative. The day after Kennedy's assassination, Hoover sent a message to Lyndon Johnson saying, quote, "I am ready to serve our government in any capacity from office boy up." Hoover spent a lot of time fishing and wrote many books during his retirement, including a multi-volume memoir, several collections of speeches and letters, a bestseller on the post-World War I peace efforts called The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, and a scathing critique of FDR's foreign policy called Freedom Betrayed, which was not published until 2012.
Hoover keeping busy. His health began to decline in 1962 at the age of 88 when he underwent intestinal surgery. He was wheelchair-bound and confined to his suite at the Waldorf Astoria until October 20th, 1964, when he died as a result of internal bleeding at the age of 90 with his two sons at his bedside. After a funeral in New York, his body was transported to Washington, D.C., where it lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda before being finally interred in West Branch, Iowa, where his birthplace cottage had been preserved and the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum erected in 1962. Lou Hoover was soon reinterred at his side. At the time, John Adams was the only president who lived longer, and by only about 6 months, though Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter have since surpassed them both. Hoover's post-presidency of 31 years was the longest ever at the time, and has since been surpassed only by Carter.
That's it. Jimmy Carter still alive at the time of this recording. But that brings us to the end of Herbert Hoover, but not quite the end of this episode, because as always, we want to try and sum up Herbert Hoover. And, well, sometimes that's best left to his contemporaries. Beginning with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who said in 1920, quote, "He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one."
And what a difference 12 years makes, as we have, again, Franklin D. Roosevelt, this time in 1932, saying, quote, "I accuse the present administration of being the greatest spending administration in peacetime in all our history. It is an administration that has piled bureau on bureau, commission on commission, and has failed to anticipate the dire needs of and the reduced earning power of our people."
Well, we also have journalist Walter Lippmann, who said in the same year, 1932, quote, "Mr. Hoover has long since abandoned his old faith in rugged individualism. His platform is a document of indefatigable paternalism. Its spirit is that of the great white father providing help for all his people. Every conceivable interest which has votes is offered protection or subsidies or access of some kind to the Treasury."
And again, we have Walter Lippmann, who would say in 1964, upon Hoover's death, quote, "I would venture to say that for the disaster which engulfed him in the White House, Hoover was in no way responsible. As president, he adopted pragmatically virtually all the main principles of the early years of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Mr. Hoover's historic position as a radical innovator has been greatly underestimated, and Mr. Roosevelt's pioneering has been greatly exaggerated. It was Mr. Hoover who abandoned the principles of laissez-faire in relation to the business cycle, established the conviction that prosperity and depression can be publicly controlled by political action, and drove out of the public consciousness the old idea that depressions must be overcome by private adjustment."
Wow, what a difference 32 years makes.
Indeed.
And that's going to bring us to former Vice President John Nance Garner, who said in 1948, quote, "I never reflected on the personal character or integrity of Herbert Hoover. I never doubted his probity or his patriotism. In many ways, he was superbly equipped for the presidency. If he had been president in 1921 or 1937, he might have ranked with the great presidents." Our listeners can feel free to rank Herbert Hoover where they see fit after being enlightened by this episode, which we're not quite done yet. There's a couple more things to talk about when it comes to Herbert Hoover. Got some book recommendations, first and foremost. I actually have a first edition of Herbert Hoover's American Individualism, the little pocket book. You could read it under a tree in a couple hours, in an hour, I bet.
Nice. Yeah, Herbert Hoover wrote a lot of books, and there are many written about him, including, as we mentioned before, Kenneth White's biography, Hoover.
Yeah, I think this is pretty much the cream of the crop when it comes to scholarly biographies on Herbert Hoover.
Yep, relatively new. Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. Yep, I did read this one in preparation of this episode. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, Hoover, oft misunderstood.
I would also recommend Amity Schleye's book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Amity Schleye's author of the Coolidge biography that we recommended during the Coolidge episode. A very interesting account of the Great Depression.
Absolutely, and if you're really hard for Hoover, I believe that somebody wrote like a 6-volume work on the life of Herbert Hoover. And we've mentioned them before, the great PBS American Experience documentaries. They got one on Hoover called Landslide, Portrait of a President, about Herbert Hoover. It's only about an hour long, but it's good. I mean, I would say just listen to this episode, but if you want some visual, that's a nice supplement to this episode. Herbert Hoover does have a home you could go visit.
Yep, West Branch, Iowa. His birthplace, where it's also his presidential library has been established. You can go see where Hoover began, where he almost died at the age of 2.
That's it. Can't speak anymore on the home. But there is somebody that could speak a little bit more on Herbert Hoover, and that's Herbert Hoover himself, with the help of our house band, the Constitutionalists. We're going to leave you with yet another musical endeavor by those wizards of music,
with Herbert Hoover himself on lead vocals.
That's just it. Here is the Constitutionalists with Herbert Hoover. For the Dead Presidents Podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
It shall appear, while I have had the honor of the presidency, I have contributed to the part required from this high office, bringing the republic through this dark night. And if in my administration we shall see the break of dawn of the better day, I shall have done my part in the world. Should my countrymen of this high office, I shall carry forward the work of reconstruction. I shall hope long before another 4 years have passed to see the world prosperous and at peace in every American home, again in the sunshine of genuine progress and of genuine prosperity. I shall seek to maintain untarnished and unweakened those fundamental traditions and principles upon which our nation was founded, upon which it has grown. I shall invite and welcome the help of every man and woman in the preservation of the United States for the happiness of its people. This is my pledge to the nation and my pledge to the Almighty God.